You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 10th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, the world waits for Israel's response to last week's missile attack by Iran. And the longer it takes, the more fault lines are exposed in Israel's relationship with the US. We'll assess the situation. Also coming up.
Українська правда заявила про тривалий і системний тиск з боку Офісу президента.
The delicate balance of keeping quiet and speaking out. Ukraine's biggest newspaper claims it's come under pressure from the government to bury bad stories. Plus, did the US really forget to take home a missile system after exercises with the Philippines? We'll examine a story of accidental or deliberate bad packing. And we cross over the road to the Regent's Park here in London for our annual trip to the Frieze Art Fair.
Whether something's made from 3000 BC or in 1941, we're always looking for that sort of the expression of human emotion and what it is to be human.
That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. Hurricane Milton has brought high winds, tornadoes and rain to Florida. Millions left the state after officials warned the impact would be catastrophic. Israeli police say 5 armed Palestinians have been shot dead by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank city of Nablus. And Saudi Arabia has failed in its latest bid for a seat on the United Nations Human Rights Council. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, the world will only know the nature of Israel's response to last week's missile attacks by Iran after the event. There's been plenty of speculation and debate about what form this will take, and questions are also being asked about the strength of relationships between Israel and its closest ally, the US. Yesterday, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris spoke to Benjamin Netanyahu for the first time in weeks. Well, let's get more on this with our guests. I'm joined here in the studio by Bill Law, Middle East analyst and editor of Arab Digest, and on the line from Dubai by Greg Karlstrom, Middle East correspondent and author of How Long Will Israel Survive? The Threat from Within. A very good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's start with you, Greg. I mean, what happened or what do we know about this conversation among Biden, Harris and Netanyahu? The readout from the call is brief. It just says it was direct and positive. Is there anything else that we know?
No, there's not. We know that they had a phone call. We know that it started at around 10:30 in Washington yesterday. And as you say, we know that they're calling it positive. But the substance of it, no one on the Israeli side or the American side has really commented on. Obviously, it was a discussion about Iran, primarily about this question of how Israel is going to retaliate against Iran, but we haven't heard much about whether any conclusions were reached on this call.
And Bill, just turning to you now, Joe Biden does not want Israel to target nuclear facilities. There are red lines here that the US would like to draw, but there is a sense that actually Israel would just plough its own path.
Yeah, you're quite right, Emma, that Biden has made it clear publicly, and I'm sure he reiterated it in that phone call, that America was not going to take part in any efforts by the Israelis to target the nuclear capabilities, nuclear facilities at Natanz. But, you've got a situation where Netanyahu feels that he's got wind in his sails, and he will have said, I think, look, this is the opportunity that we can take out my great foe, your great foe. Why don't we go for it? The fact of the matter is that to take out in any serious way the nuclear capability would require the kind of bombs that the Israelis don't have. It would require the kind of planes that carry those big bombs that the Israelis don't have, and the Americans are not going to play ball on that one. So, what is Netanyahu left with? The thirst for vengeance is strong. I think what is stronger for him is the political opportunism that he sees, that he can display himself as the great savior, the great defender, of Israel, the man who struck the lethal blow against Israel's greatest enemy, Iran. I think it's dangerously hallucinatory, but there it is. That's where we are.
Greg, to what degree do we understand that the mood that Bill has just described is being reflected in Israel? I mean, Israel, are we seeing Israel spotting an opportunity to hurt the Islamic regime in Iran? It could bring it down, and perhaps this is being considered to be a once-in-a-generational chance to do damage to what Bill calls its great foe.
It's a widespread view in Israel right now. I think one thing that has been striking over the past month is the extent to which it's not just Netanyahu himself pushing for this, it's people within his government, it's people within the army and the security services, and it's even the political opposition that is pushing in that direction. When it comes to Lebanon, for example, there is broad agreement across the political spectrum in Israel that they have a chance to remove Hezbollah from power in Lebanon, to seriously degrade its military capabilities. When it comes to Iran, there is this feeling that as Bill says, they can deal a blow to their greatest enemy. The mood has swung. Where a month ago in Israel, there was this widespread pessimism about the war in Gaza, which seemed not to be going anywhere. And there was no progress towards a deal to free the hostages because Netanyahu was rejecting that. And the war seemed to have stalled and become the quagmire. The mood now in Israel is almost exuberant. And there is this feeling that they can reshape the Middle East is the sort of language that they are using right now.
But as you say, Bill, this reshaping of the Middle East is dependent to a great extent on the United States. And Joe Biden and the US are clearly reluctant to be dragged into a war between Israel and Iran. But is there a sense that Israel wants the US to do the heavy lifting, the tougher work for them?
Well, yeah, I think so. And I think that the U.S. has made it clear they're not going to do that. So we're left in this place right now where we're all sort of waiting to see what the Israelis will do. It's interesting that the Iranian foreign minister was in Riyadh. He not only met with his counterpart foreign minister, he also met with Mohammed bin Salman. And that picture of that meeting was splashed very heavily across Saudi media. This clearly is sending a signal that the Saudis and, of course, the Emiratis, the last thing they want to see is this thing hotting up any further than it already is. And, of course, Netanyahu is very, very keen to get Saudi Arabia engaged in the Abraham Accords. This is part of his reshaping of the Middle East. So these two objectives are kind of counterpointing each other, and they don't, to me, make any strategic sense. I mean, you could see some tactical advantage in trying to hit the Iranians hard whilst they are in this place of uncertainty. They've suffered serious, grievous damage to their axis of resistance. There's no question they're hurting. The idea that you can solve this situation with military solutions is one that the Israelis and Netanyahu have clung to for decades, and they continue to persist in it, even though it's clear that this is leading us down, a very dangerous road.
Bill, could they actually succeed in taking down the Islamic regime in Iran?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you look at regime change, the record of regime change in the Middle East has been disastrous. So I don't think the Israelis are going to achieve that. And of course, you look at, Netanyahu saying to the Lebanese, now is your opportunity, get rid of Hezbollah. Well, Hezbollah is effectively the only functioning political party as well as being a military wing. These kind of things are, again, I use the word hallucinatory, and I think that's dangerous.
Greg, just let's examine once again the position that the United States occupies in all this. I mean, the Wall Street Journal's headline in the last couple of hours is US frustrated by Israel's reluctance to share Iran's retaliation plans. It's been mentioned quite frequently recently that the United States' position of influence in the region is greatly diminished. I mean, to what degree does that feel borne out where you are?
Very much so. I mean, I think there's a view of the United States over the past year that it is either completely hostage to events, that it is naive and that it is unable to exert any influence over Israel, or that the Biden administration sort of privately agrees with everything that Israel has done over the past year, and it can't quite say that in public. But it has demonstrated that through its actions by giving Israel ironclad military and diplomatic support. And so, it's this very odd position now where every couple of days, someone within the administration will privately leak statements like these to the Wall Street Journal about how they're frustrated that the Israelis aren't talking to them, or they don't trust the Israeli government anymore. They've lost confidence in the Israeli government. They're very happy to go and tell journalists off the record that the Israelis are taking advantage of them, but then they continue to let the Israelis take advantage of them. And so there's a feeling, I think, particularly in the Gulf, particularly when it comes to countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, there is a feeling that America is just not in control at all of what's happening, what Israel is doing in the region. And there's a sense that America has lost a tremendous amount of influence over the past year.
So staying with you, Greg, is there a sense of anybody who might well be in control here, who might be able to sort of get a handle on things?
No, there's really not. I mean, if you look at other great powers, the Russians have shown, a bit of appetite historically to get involved in the region, but they're preoccupied with Ukraine at this point, and they're not able to exert much influence in the Middle East. China is a big and growing power in the region, but it is primarily still an economic power, and its forays into diplomacy in the Middle East have been quite limited, to say nothing of military and security matters, which it has largely kept out of. And so that leaves regional powers to try and drive events. And the Gulf states, as Bill said, very, very nervous about the prospect that this regional conflict might end up blowing back on them. And so what they're trying to do above all is just to secure their own interests and remain neutral and stay on the sidelines. And then so many of the other countries in the Arab world have been just terminally weakened by decades of civil war, decades of conflict, decades of mismanagement. So, it feels almost like the region is in this non-polar moment right now where no one is really in charge, no one is really driving events.
And Bill, just staying on the subject with you, that the sense that there is no one driving events, but alliances are being formed and contacts are being made within the region now to try to calm things down and to try to at least not sort of offer support to Iran or anything like that, but to actually just make sure that lines of communication are remaining open.
Yeah, that's key, and it's clear that the Saudis and the Emiratis are taking a lead in that. I would argue, too, that there is an opportunity for the United Kingdom, which has, skinny in the game, going back many, many decades as well, to take a stand that is perhaps distinct from this American situation, which Greg has described very, very well, that the Americans are not only have lost hugely influence in the region, they are kind of staggering around themselves, not knowing what to do with Netanyahu and the Israelis. So I would urge the UK government to think about standing up and making some sensible statements, using our contacts, which we have many, to try and move towards diplomatic solutions as opposed to military, because that's all we're hearing from the Israelis is military, military, military. It is not going to give them the long-term security they're seeking. It's only going to make the region that much more insecure.
Bill Law and Greg Karlstrom, thank you both so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. 9:14 in Kyiv, 7:14 a.m. here in London. Now, the main newspaper in Ukraine has spoken out against the country's government, saying they are being pressured into not covering stories to do with corruption or ineffective governance. Ukrainska Pravda published the announcement, threatening to take it further. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Daniela Peled, managing editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. Good morning, Daniela.
Good morning.
So what exactly has Ukrainska Pravda said?
Well, they've taken the highly unusual step of publishing a statement on their website. They allege that officials are being told not to speak to them, that they're being denied access to official events, and quite interestingly, businesses were coming under pressure not to invest and advertise on the outlet or sponsor its its events as well. I mean, this is another very important but often overlooked source of pressure on independent media, investment and advertising.
So just tell us a little bit about what they're hoping to sort of draw the world's attention to, because the risks of actually stepping up and saying the government is putting pressure on us to not expose corruption is a risky move for both the newspaper but also for the government itself.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's been no one can deny that Ukraine has made huge steps towards improving press freedom since 2014, and that ongoing even during a full-scale conflict. Reporters Without Borders have upgraded its place on the World Press Freedom Index last year. But there are still all kinds of subtle issues going on, especially as the full-scale invasion continues as well. There is, controversially, there's the unified telecoms marathon after the full-scale invasion. All the news outlets, news on TV, were unified into one unified broadcast, which produces the same material to increase accuracy and combat disinformation. And it's supposed to have editorial independence as well, but there's been criticisms of that. Who's in, who's out, and to what extent can you guarantee editorial freedom under those circumstances? There's been other recent incidents of harassment of journalists around the country increasing at a local level. For instance, local journalists reporting on corruption. And there's also been ongoing complaints. And at IWPR, we work with a lot of Ukrainian frontline journalists, that it's harder to work on the front lines, where you're exposing yourself to serious risk, but you're having decreasing access. And the army is, as armies tend to do, not prioritising freedom of speech and access for journalists as it operates.
Because there is a genuine value to silence, isn't there? What are your cohorts and colleagues in Ukraine saying about the fact that if you expose widespread corruption in Ukraine, you risk those who have been helping you so far, militarily and financially, changing their mind and withdrawing that help. And that opens up a grave crisis for Ukraine in its fight against Russia.
Well, this is an ongoing and very live discussion that I've had so many times in recent years. The argument, which is very compelling, is saying actually by exposing corruption, and journalists everywhere will make this argument, you're actually supporting freedom, democracy, the future of your country. As I said, corruption has always been an extremely live issue in Ukraine, and it's not going to go away. Reconstruction, which will happen after this active phase of conflict finishes, is going to be a huge billion-trillion-dollar affair, and donors are going to want to see that there are robust systems in place to prevent money going astray, and journalism, especially local journalism, is an integral part of this. The fact, I think that it's been quite a good PR win for Ukraine that even during this conflict, journalists are holding government officials, very senior government officials, to account, and investigations have led to resignations and real changes. So I think that argument has been made quite successfully. It's a little bit more difficult when it comes to exposing other issues, perhaps military wrongdoing and other routes to criticism. I think corruption, there's a broad public consensus that this is an okay thing for journalists to investigate.
So tell us what happens next. I mean, talking to your colleagues in Ukraine, what are they choosing to do?
Well, what people are doing, and what we have done at IWPR as well, is just continuing reporting on this. Reporting on the progress of the war and civil society, and judicial processes, of course, but also reporting on threats to journalists. I mean, the threats to journalists in Ukraine, from obviously the main threat is the ongoing conflict, but the other threats, intimidation and lack of access to press conferences and free flow of information, may seem less egregious compared to other countries in the world. But it's important, really important, to keep the pressure up on on the government and the institutions. And this is what Ukraine's Pravda has done. They've said, right, next time we feel we're being intimidated, we're going to make it public. We're not going to play these games anymore. And I think also the very important thing, and this is you see it across countries in conflict, what happens the day after? If you have this system where censorship, even mild censorship, and importantly, self-censorship becomes normalized, what happens when you transition to peace and you carry on building democracy? That does not bode well.
Daniela Pelled, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
Whether something's made from 3000 BC or in 1941, we're always looking for that sort of the expression of human emotion and what it is to be human.
We look at the enduring power of art as Frieze hits London. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
7:21 here in London. Let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Mark Paul, London correspondent for the Irish Times. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
Looking neat as a pin, may I say.
It is not.
I think we have to add a little bit of context. It is not often that it's an early programme. Let's be honest, here in London. Not often that someone turns up in a nice jacket.
Well, I'm going from here straight to Westminster. So.
Okay, so you have to do stuff. How is Westminster looking? What are we looking at today?
Well, the aftermath of yesterday, which was that Tory surprise in the 1922 committee room when James Cleverly got knocked out of the race to be the next Tory leader. I was in the room for it. It was a bit of a surprise.
What was that like? What did it feel like?
Well, there was an audible gasp in the room and real shock, and it was a bit of a plot twist from the Tories. But we've had quite a lot of those.
I was about to say they're quite good at that, and they're quite good at picking leaders that nobody wants.
Yes, but at least they've confirmed one thing, which is that they're going to lurch even further to the right, because it's this choice of right between Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick. So that's the direction the party's going to go.
Good stuff. Thank you for that. Let's have a look at the papers. What have you picked up on?
Well, the first story I picked up on was a story in the Telegraph, and it's about North Korean troops fighting for Putin who were killed in Ukraine. And it's basically based on an estimation by the South Korean government that a group of North Korean officers were killed in a missile strike in Ukraine on the front lines in Donetsk. And the interesting bit of the story that sort of caught my eye was that according to the South Korean government, I mean, this basically means that North Korea and Russia are in a formal military alliance, and that they think that the deployment of regular North Korean troops in Ukraine is highly likely. Now, I mean, that's a bit of a boon for Vladimir Putin. North Korea has given him about 5 million artillery shells for this war. And if he starts to run out of soldiers, I mean, there's a suggestion that maybe North Korea could fill the gap. And that could prolong this war for a long, long time, if that's the case. And I suppose it also raises an interesting question as to whether or not Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, whether he actually wants to give his soldiers, I suppose, real-life experience in a theatre of war.
This is the thing that's being raised in the Daily Telegraph's article, which is that North Korea now learns to fight in someone else's war.
Exactly. It's a theatre of war where they can practice their skills, because they actually haven't fought in a long time in a real war like this. And also as well, I think it shines a light on this kind of budding bromance between Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, and the fact that, you know, I mean, it was Putin's 72nd birthday on Monday, and he got a greeting from Kim Jong-un to say that he was his closest comrade.
His closest comrade. There is that strange thing, isn't it? Because there's always an element of levity to an encounter between Kim Jong-un and another authoritarian leader somewhere. And you always find it a little bit funny that they're in a car together and they're chinking glasses of red wine, and the chemistry between them is palpable. It's absolutely evident. Nonetheless, what we speak of today has phenomenally serious consequences in terms of the spread of war and the involvement of other military in Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, it does. I mean, obviously the kind of closeness between Russia and China is something that's often commented upon, but a sort of a close relationship between Russia and North Korea could have much stronger consequences for this war, could prolong it for a long, long time. And I mean, that could have consequences for all of Europe. And if Donald Trump was to win in November, and you've got a bit of a trio there, haven't you, between Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un.
Let's move to the US presidential race. Kamala Harris putting aside her campaign in order to deal with the hurricanes which are barreling across the country. That's not stopping those having a bit of a dig around. There's been arguably the Harris campaign has been blissfully bereft of gossip and nastiness. They've managed to keep their noses pretty clean. Until now? Until now.
I mean, the Times has a very good long read on this story about Doug Emhoff, who is Kamala Harris's husband. And this kind of story that has emerged, this accusation that 12 years ago, before he married Kamala Harris, he's supposed to have slapped quite hard an ex-girlfriend of his in a kind of a drunken row after accusing her of flirting. And this is the accusation that has been made by women who say they're friends of this woman. Now, it has been denied once by the Harris campaign to an online publication, but after that they've stonewalled everybody else. They've stonewalled the Times, they've stonewalled the Daily Mail and other newspapers. But this story has been seized upon by the Trump campaign and by Donald Trump in particular, who has amplified it as a kind of an example of just to throw some shade at their campaign. Obviously there's a serious accusation behind all of this. Whether or not it's true, we don't know. But I think what's interesting from a political point of view is just the way this reflects on Emhoff, who would be America's first gentleman if Kamala Harris was to win. And he's generally been seen as an asset to her campaign. And the Times poses the question, is this guy an asset or is he actually a liability now? Because according to a Democratic strategist, Hank Steinkoff, who was quoted in the Times story, I mean, this could really have an effect on the margins with certain types of voters. And the margins is where this election is going to be won and lost. And it's interesting that up until now, we haven't really made much of the fact that Kamala Harris could be the first woman president of the United States. I think that sort of issue is wrestled with Hillary Clinton, and Kamala Harris has just got on with the job. And yet suddenly you have the issue of the treatment of women coming to the top. And it does not look good for Emhoff, given the fact that the campaign has sort of not handled it very well. It's not responded to some comments from various media outlets. How big a problem could this be? Because we're talking about how the act of God, the hurricane, could be the great October surprise. Could Emhoff be the October surprise as well? Well, I suppose it's possible. And it's interesting that you raised that question about the treatment of women, because, of course, one of the Democratic criticisms of the MAGA campaign is this kind of toxic masculinity and this over-the-top machismo of MAGA supporters. And yet here you have the man who would be first gentleman, who is portrayed as an ally of women, and facing this toxic accusation of his own. And according to this Democratic strategist that's quoted in the story, I mean, he says that the big danger here is that it can create a sense that something is not quite right with Kamala Harris as she keeps backing him on this. So there is I guess there's the potential there for this to become a bigger story for the campaign as time goes on. Let's jump into your patch, into the Irish Times. Let's get an Irish Times story out. Mark, tell us about the position of Ireland when it comes to the situation in Gaza. Well, Ireland is a country that in recent months chose to formally recognise Palestine as a country. The Irish people generally and the Irish government has taken a very critical stance of Israel's actions. But what this story in the Irish Times is really about is about another Harris, Simon Harris, who's the Irish Taoiseach, who yesterday was over in Washington to visit Joe Biden, and they were supposed to have a big reception with 300 people in the Rose Garden, but of course the hurricane of Florida put pay to that. But effectively, you have a 37-year-old Irish leader who's gone over to Washington to effectively mildly lecture an 82-year-old US president about the situation in Palestine. And I suppose in one sense, maybe it shows a little bit of the sort of growing confidence maybe of Ireland on the international stage that they would do this. But it also raises another question, because traditionally when Irish leaders go to Washington, for some sort of a sit down with the president. It's normally done in March and St. Patrick's Day, but they usually come back and they either resign or they call an election. Leo Varadkar in March went over for the St. Patrick's Day thing. 2 days later, he quit. Simon Harris, the expectation is maybe when he lands on the tarmac back in Dublin Airport, be that today, I guess, sometime later today, he might well call an election. There's an election due in Ireland. They usually see this as their big moment in the sun, in the lights, and then they usually call an election. So that's what might happen. But there's a kind of a funny little postscript to it, is that Boris Johnson, in his new book, Unleashed, has a delicious little section in it where he says that he claims that in private, Joe Biden told him that his ancestry wasn't really Irish at all, that it was actually English.
Right. Okay. How much truth do we attribute to that? We'll watch Ireland. Thank you for that, because the Taoiseach's in America. I love that twist. Finally, okay. End of the day. It's been a long day at the Irish Times. You're in your pajamas. You've got the telly on. Emily in Paris. Is that on in the Paul household a lot?
Well, it is if my teenage daughter is anywhere near the remote control, and she generally rules the roost. So yeah, there's a story in The Guardian about Emily in Paris, which is this schmaltzy, saccharine show about, it's a rom-com on Netflix about a Chicago marketing executive who goes off to work in Paris, and there's this idealised, glamorised version of Paris. And of course, the French media think that this smash hit show is terrible.
I love the fact that there's lots of publicity.
Oh, lots of publicity, lots of tourism. But it actually seems that, and this is at the heart of this story, that deep down they actually do love it after all, because Emily in Paris, it looks like, for season 5 is heading off to Rome. And Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, was quoted yesterday as saying that we will fight hard to prevent this, and we will ask them to remain in Paris because Emily in Paris in Rome doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. Nor does it make an awful lot of sense. Or perhaps it does. You were talking about your Taoiseach going off and then coming back and and capitalising on a bounce.
Yes.
I wonder whether Emmanuel Macron, not necessarily having the greatest of times, has thought, actually, if we do a bit of international soft power, then everyone will love us.
Perhaps it is. But then, if Emily goes off to Rome, then the Italians are going to have to deal with Emily's cliched kind of reconstructions of their city and of their country. And we'll see, maybe the Romans won't know what hit them, I think, when Emily goes there.
Mark Paul, thank you as ever for joining us in the studio. The time here in London is 7:31. Excuse me. The time here in London, I should say, is 7:31. You're listening to Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. And look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. Hurricane Milton has brought high winds, tornadoes and rain to Florida. More than 2 million homes are without power, and deaths have been reported on the state's east coast. Millions left the state after officials warned the impact would be catastrophic. Meanwhile, President Biden has accused Donald Trump of an onslaught of lies over the US government's response to 2 major hurricanes. Mr. Biden warned that disinformation had undermined preparations for Hurricane Milton. In other news, Israeli police say 5 armed Palestinians have been shot dead by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank city of Nablus. Police say those killed had taken part in attacks on Israeli citizens. And Lebanon has accused Israel of targeting its rescue and ambulance teams. The state's civil defense body says 5 of its personnel were killed in the south of the country. And Saudi Arabia has failed in its latest bid for a seat on the United Nations Human Rights Council. Human rights groups who'd lobbied states not to elect Saudi Arabia to the council have welcomed the decision. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, our next story had its birth in April this year when the US deployed its Typhoon missile system to the Philippines as part of a joint military exercise. Well, as we approach the midpoint of October, it appears the missile system is still there, despite a pledge by the US to remove it last month. Well, joining me now from Manila is Richard Haydarian, an academic, columnist and author of The Rise of Duterte, a populist revolt, against elite democracy. A very warm welcome back to Monocle Radio, Richard. Good afternoon.
As always, good morning, folks.
So just tell us about the original purpose of this deployment.
Yeah, there's actually, I won't say a fog of war, but there's a lot of equivocation around this weapon system. It's a medium-range weapon system, which is capable of launching missiles, including SAM-6 missiles and Tomahawks over 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers. So the range is pretty significant. But this is a state-of-the-art, much-vaunted missile system developed by the United States just a few years ago. And for the first time ever, there was a deployment to the Indo-Pacific region, to this part of the world, and that was for the Balikatan exercises between the United States and the Philippines, whereby close to 16,000 troops were involved. And much of those exercises were actually simulating potential warfare with China, without obviously mentioning China directly. So since April this year, China has been furious and has been trying to portray this as a kind of a provocative action, something that will put China in threat. I won't say this is a kind of a Cuban Missile System crisis, but China is clearly trying to make a drama along those lines. Initially, the Philippine government and also the Americans said that, no, this was really not, for deployment and war games. This was just for a logistical exercise. The next thing we know, it's still in the country. And the next thing we know, Philippine officials openly saying, we want to keep this weapon system in the Philippines indefinitely. So that has really outraged China, because China knows if that weapon system is in the Philippines, it will make their invasion of Taiwan or any major activity or kinetic action in the region against any other country very, very difficult. Those are state-of-the-art weapon systems, and China fears more of those could even be deployed down the road to the Philippines.
Indeed, because the Typhoon systems can reach targets within Chinese territory. This is a serious piece of kit which is being placed there. Is anybody giving a reason as to why they have left it there? I mean, obviously the Philippines have said, OK, we've got it now. Can we keep it, please? But has anyone actually explained the situation?
Well, as you may know, China has its own carrier killer A2AD asymmetric strategy against the United States in the event that U.S. sends massive aircraft carriers to rescue, say, Taiwan or even the Philippines, if ever there's an all-out regional warfare. So those weapon systems of China targeting American aircraft carriers would be based in southern Chinese provinces. So this weapon system, the Typhoon missile system, very sophisticated. If it's established in the Philippines and in some of the islands close to southern China, then that puts China also within its own range. So that kind of cancels out or kind of dissipates whatever advantage China is trying to build. On the part of the Philippines, obviously, we don't want to get dragged into any kind of a major power conflict. But we are a U.S. treaty ally, and we want to also keep the Chinese guessing. In fact, one Filipino official unabashedly said, we want to give the Chinese nightmares, right? Because they have been giving us nightmares and worse in the South China Sea over the past year or so with multiple incidents there. So I think part of this is really psychological warfare, but I think part of this is also leverage. Because if you're the Philippines, your argument would be pretty simple to China. The more you pressure us, you press us in the South China Sea, the more you push the envelope there, the more we allow the Americans to not only keep these weapon systems, but to deploy more and more weapon systems like this to northern Philippines, where new facilities have been opened up to the Americans under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. So suddenly the Philippines is in a driving seat, although obviously this carries its own risks.
And it is interesting to think that this one missile system's presence in the Philippines could completely recalibrate the way that the region, It's interesting to think that the presence of this single weapon system could completely recalibrate the way that the region looks to China. And one wonders if other countries are going to start to ask for these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, probably some of the ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, because as we speak, the ASEAN Summit is also happening, are going to try to, especially those who are friendlier to China, will try to use this and say the Philippines is kind of a, part of a proxy war against the United States. But I think this missile defense system drama kind of replicates what happened in South Korea a few years earlier over the THAAD missile system, which the Koreans had, to go through a lot of diplomatic reprimand by the Chinese, but eventually they held their ground. So I think the Philippines has a lesson to learn from neighboring South Korea. But down the road, this is neither about the Philippines or Taiwan alone. This is probably about America's plan to disperse all sorts of advanced weapon systems across the region to also keep the Chinese in check and make them think twice before they try to hit the Americans. So this is the kind of a missile defense arms race that we're seeing in this part of the world. But my suspicion is the Filipinos are also looking at acquiring these weapon systems down the road as a kind of incentive as they also take the risk. Because I think the Philippines is also saying, hey, we don't want to be just a bunch of hosts for your weapon systems down the road. We want to also develop our own defensive capability. In fact, the Philippines just launched a comprehensive archipelagic defense capability, a strategy. And, we have one of the largest coastlines in the world. We have as much coastline as Russia. So that just tells you that the Philippines also may need this weapon systems for itself down the road if things move in a very troubling direction as it has there in Europe, in Ukraine, and not to mention in the Middle East over the past few months.
Richard Haydarian, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. 8:39 in Zurich, 7:39 here in London. You're back with The Globalist. Now, last week, the European Union voted to impose tariffs on imports of Chinese electric cars. It was in order to create a more level playing field between the bloc's automotive industry and Beijing's. One of the concerns raised, however, by the likes of the German car manufacturer BMW was that any retaliatory move by the Chinese would damage exports. Well, I'm joined now by Robin Brandt, BBC former China correspondent and regular voice around the microphones here at Monocle Radio. Good morning, Robin.
Hello, how are you?
So just explain to us, how much do the EU tariffs smart China?
Well, look, this playbook is a very common one for anyone who has seen China try to exert its influence and change the policy of governments, whether that's adversarial or fairly allied, over the years. China's EV industry is immense. It is one of the sectors that it seeks to dominate over recent years. It has this Made in China 2025 plan. It involves aviation, biomedicine, and at the heart of that, alongside solar and other sustainable energy technologies, is electric vehicles and the batteries that make them. And China is becoming, or if not already, is dominant in this sector. Outside your office here, you'll see MGs, cars that are made in Shanghai. They're spreading all over the world. They are very affordable. They're made at huge scale. And the EU and others say, and this is a key part of the argument, they are manufactured at that scale with huge subsidies from Chinese government, both provincial and national. That's what they say is unfair. That's why they want to put on these 45% tariffs. And that is what the European Union is doing. China says it's unfair. It doesn't believe that this is required, is justified. And so it's now looking at anti-dumping measures against cognac from France, dairy products from across the EU, pork from Spain, maybe even those beautiful BMWs coming from Germany as well.
This is interesting, isn't it? I mean, you've mentioned cognac, pork, and what was the other thing that you
dairy.
spoke about? Dairy. But none of these are hugely devastating products that could hit Europe
Well, I mean, cognac
hard.
in France.
Okay, I'll give you that. But a lot of it's kept in France for the French. But the interesting thing here is that they haven't come back with anything, sort of any kind of like major retaliation, such as we're going to target luxury goods, for example, although the luxury goods market has suffered a bit since the announcement.
Yeah, so
they
what
seem
you
to
have
be piecemeal.
You have manoeuvring. You have the beginnings of a tit for tat. You have reciprocal measures that China hopes will convince people like President Emmanuel Macron of France to change his mind. France is one of the biggest initiators, biggest supporters of these tariffs. And so what it's doing is a very common tactic as well. It's trying to divide and conquer. It's trying to pick off members of the 27 member EU bloc. We've talked about France. We've talked about Spain. We've talked about others. It's trying to get them to change their minds by these targeted measures, which will be painful in certain areas of the country for certain industries. But you're right, it's not a much more all-out kind of trade war along the likes of what we saw under the Trump administration between 2016 and 2020. It's much more of a slightly more nuanced dance in terms of targeting certain sectors that it has political symbolism as well. And we've talked about cognac, we've talked about pork coming from Spain, those BMWs, big engine Mercedes being exported from Germany to China. There are many people on the German side, particularly at the moment, the way that domestic economy is going, who don't want to see further measures like that.
There is that thought, though, that in 5, 10, 15 years' time, unless something is done about it now, then the Chinese presence globally when it comes to things like electric vehicles will be sort of unassailable. And you look at what has happened in America, the stringent tariffs that they've put on the import of electric vehicles, so much more tight, 100% for the Americans. What does this say about the rest of the world trying to sort of like push back against China in the long term?
Well, that's a really important point, because you're right. The North American market, Canadians as well, have essentially frozen out the export of these Chinese vehicles. The UK is different. It's choosing to go a different way. Obviously not a member of the European Union at the moment. The European Union is trying to hold the line because it wants to develop, of course, its own domestic EV industry. That's why we're seeing France in particular, and the role of Renault there holding such a strong line in terms of trying to keep these cheaper Chinese EVs out of the market. It's also about technology as well, though. It's not just simply about protecting the industry and making it more competitive for these factories in France and elsewhere to make these cars. It's about trying to develop a more sustainable and more reliable supply chain when it comes to these cars, when it comes to the batteries, so that the EU can stand on its own and try and learn the lessons, try and de-risk. We were talking a lot about that, weren't we, over the last couple of years? De-risk in terms of supply chain and rely less on what's coming from China to the rest of the world.
Robin Brent, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's time to talk aviation news. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio is Sally Gethin, aviation analyst. Very good morning to you, Sally. How's life?
Morning.
Good. Let's crack on with, let's touch on the current situation in Florida when we have Hurricane Milton, which is causing, is sort of ploughing its devastating path across the state. But we look at the aviation world, and obviously airports in Florida are closing, but before that, what were the airlines doing to try to get people out?
Yes, well, actually, airlines did add capacity to be able to evacuate the affected areas. So nearly 2,000 extra flights were put on, providing extra seats to people who needed to leave. And also, they are providing waivers, which means that you can switch to a later date without any extra charge. And that's quite a big deal in the United States because economy or coach fares don't usually have that flexibility. And in cases where you absolutely can't fly, you've been caught out, you'll get a refund. So, and the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, has been on the airwaves talking about this and explaining the measures in place. So it's a coordinated effort by the aviation community, which is very good. But airports obviously had to start closing early. I mean, the airports in the affected areas like Tampa, and St. Pete, Clearwater, a number of those airports had to completely close down. But even other airports have been badly affected, even though they might still stay open, which is Miami Airport, for example. So it really is taking out a big chunk of the US aviation network system. And this will have a knock-on effect with other flights in the United States to a smaller or larger extent.
I was going to say, how much does this generally cause a sort of a knock-on effect? I mean, how long is a recovery period after an event like this?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to say because each event obviously sets a precedent in its own way. But, you know, in my experience, you have heavy storms hitting, and when they hit a hub, and like, for example, Miami-Dade is a big hub which links not just the United States, but Latin America, South America, and North America. So, and airlines do work on this hub system, you know, where they provide their routes in and out of the major gateways. So this could go on maybe for a day or two, I'd say. But should have a minor trickle-down effect as we head into the weekend.
Let's move on to Boeing and its continued issues and strikes with the unions. They've been on strike for nearly a month now, haven't they? What's happening there?
It's not good news. They've reached a stalemate, and the heavy hitters have got involved. The federal mediators have got involved, and even Congress, the House of Representatives, is writing to both parties urging stronger negotiation together. But now all bets are off the table. So the union is digging in deep for a long winter on this. They say that they're going to stand their ground, that they're not getting their terms met. But Boeing, worryingly, has withdrawn its 30% pay rise offer from the table and is saying there's no point in going back into negotiations at the moment because they say that the union demands are non-negotiable. So this isn't good. And like you say, it's costing a huge amount. This is going to affect aircraft production as well, particularly on the wide body, the larger aircraft down the line. So every day this carries on. It doesn't just hemorrhage money, but it affects this production. And ultimately, Boeing being such a big aircraft manufacturer, airlines are dependent on their aircraft and they're waiting for those deliveries. It means that maybe demand for air travel won't be met to quite the extent that everybody, possibly in several months down the line or a year down the line will be able to get their seats and on their routes that they want. That's how pivotal this is.
The longer term prospects for Boeing is that, well, let's look at what was happening beforehand. It was trying to recover from the scandal, the huge problem when a panel blew out mid-air in January. And its shares have dropped 40% this year.
Yes.
I mean, what does that bode for the long-term recovery of Boeing were an agreement to be made at some point with the unions?
Boeing still has plans to roll out new aircraft types as well. And it just puts a dent in all their plans for that. It just, as you say, it's had such a checkered history recently. And not only that, but the regulator in the United States, the FAA, has actually put a restraint on Boeing in terms of capping the amount of planes it could produce anyway. So it's got lots of restraints on it, not just what's happening with the unions. That's just like the perfect storm. And I think it's just a beleaguered giant at the moment. They've got a new CEO at the top, Kelly Ortberg, who promised a bright, heralded a new era, brighter future for Boeing. But whether or not he can, bring about some kind of resolution to this is questionable, because especially if Boeing is also digging in a kind of war of attrition, and somebody needs to give at the end of the day. Otherwise, Boeing, will have a very, its future could be hampered.
Finally, let's touch briefly on European air traffic control. They've not had a good summer, have they?
No, actually, this isn't anything new in the sense that it's a long-running problem. So in Europe, we have different air traffic control authorities, and the air traffic system up in the air, which you can't see, is quite interwoven and complicated. And there are plans for what's called a single European sky to simplify that and speed up, be able to improve traffic flows. What we've seen this summer, reports just come out to say that there has been an 80% increase in delays over the summer.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Sally Gethin, for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're with The Globalist. Finally, on today's programme, the Frieze Art Fair has set up its giant stall across the Euston Road here in central London, celebrating its 21st year. Monocle's Sophie Monaghan-Coombs has gone along to Frieze Masters at yesterday's preview, and she caught up with James Richards from the Gallery Charles Eade. After over 50 years in the ancient art and antiquities business, it's had a recent and quite substantial change in direction.
This is actually a new year for us at Charles Eade, so we've been going since 1971. We specialise in ancient artworks from ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt. And this year's a new entity where we're adding 19th and 20th century paintings, works on paper and photography to sort of complement that. And the gallery, as I said, has been going since 1971. It's always been known for really beautiful objects from the ancient world. And we've tried to pair that with paintings, fine art that sort of complements it, that either has a sort of sculptural quality or has a human story to tell. So, whether something's made from 3000 BC or in 1941, we're always looking for that sort of the expression of human emotion and what it is to be human. So in that vein, I really like the Clara Klinghoffer portrait, which we're exhibiting. It's from 1920. She's a British female artist who lived in Whitechapel in the East End of London. She was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, and the painting is a portrait of a fellow female artist, but from India. And it's 1920, so it's incredibly interesting to look at two women in society making names for themselves at that time, both from very different backgrounds, part of the beginning of multicultural England. And I just think it's a very empathetic, very humanizing rendition. Somebody's gone to a studio and sat for another artist, and that connection, and you can really sense that in the portrait.
And you mentioned there that this is a kind of brand new time for the gallery. And maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the decision making that went into taking quite a major step for such an established gallery to change your kind of focus areas, or to, I guess, sort of embellish and add to them after such a long time being very kind of successful and well known for your more specialised, I guess, area.
I've known the gallery for a long time. I joined in January, and we work as a team. We collectively look at the things that we're bringing to art fairs, whether they're ancient or modern, trying to find things that are very interesting, have a great story, but also beautiful. I think you need to try and marry the two. I don't think they can just be totally academic or totally beautiful. You need to try and find a balance of things that there's an interesting story to tell, but also they're well researched. We have good provenance for them, and they're in good condition. And I think it's trying to marry those things up, which is interesting. And I think things speak through the ages, and everything has a story to tell. For example, we have things that were made by the Egyptian culture. They worship different gods, but they're still humans at the end of the day. They experience the same emotions as us: fear, joy, happiness, sadness. So I think trying to find those connections is always interesting.
We are speaking today on the very first day of Frieze London and Frieze Masters. The doors opened earlier today, and I wonder how you've kind of found the atmosphere. It feels very buzzy at the moment. It's super busy. But yeah, I wonder how you're kind of thinking about Frieze London and Frieze Masters this year and how it feels.
It feels great. Our gallery's in London. I live in London, and I love being here. I think the interesting thing with Frieze Masters is we do a lot of art fairs around the world, and a lot of it is a lot of museums and collectors. And I think here you branch out from that. You get a lot of contemporary collectors, obviously, but you get people who maybe have it's part of the calendar, it's part of the social calendar, and they like to come here. And I find that really exciting because you meet old clients, you meet new ones, and you meet people who maybe don't know a certain artist, or maybe they don't know any artist. So it's a real mix here. And I think London has always been a great place for arts and culture, and I think Frieze does a really good job of promoting that within the art market.
And just to talk a little bit more about the art market, I wonder, as a gallery, how sort of optimistic you're feeling at the moment in terms of sales.
Yeah, I think we've had some great sales today, and it's only the first day. I think with Frieze, there's always people here throughout the whole weekend. What I really, the way I see the art market is that there are lots of. It's very difficult to talk about the art market as a whole. There are lots of nuances. There are lots of different fields. So sometimes when people talk about the art market, it's hard to quantify that because there's so many different, are you talking about contemporary art? Are you talking about collecting wine or posters or drawings or old masters? There are so many different fields and so many nuances to it. So for us, we just try and find beautiful things. And I think people really appreciate that, and it seems to be doing well for us. It has done since 1971, and people have been very complimentary about the new direction. So yeah, we're very happy.
That was James Richards from Charles Eade at Frieze Masters. The Frieze Art Fair takes place in Regent's Park until Sunday. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, and thanks too to our producers Anita Riotta, Tom Webb and Laura Kramer. Our researcher was George Ruskin and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London, and The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.